Welcome viewers to the MOOC's online course on Introduction to Indian Art and Appreciation. This is the 5th module of the 2nd week on religious and cultural diversities of Indian art. And in this module, we will be looking at the emergence of Islamic architecture, or what is also known as the Indo-Islamic architecture in India. We will be looking at some of the finest specimens from Sultanate and Mughal period. Now, Indo-Islamic architecture refers to the art of the Indian architecture that resulted from the cultural intermingling after the advent of the Muslim rulers into the Indian subcontinent. So far, good. It is also true that some of the very important innovations that these Turkish rulers introduced was the use of the arch and the dome on a larger scale. Because of certain architectural innovation and certain technological know-how, in Indo-Islamic architecture you find huge scale. In terms of scale, they are really huge domes and arches, and because of certain requirements of this new society, these huge structures were able to satisfy these demands most perfectly, most satisfactorily. Now, the Arabs had borrowed this from the Eastern Roman Empire at Byzantine as far as the huge arch and dome is concerned. The new architectural form, made possible by mortar of a superior kind, used geometrical and floral decorative designs which were partly derived from an established tradition of indigenous architecture. The Muslim rulers, however, did not decorate their buildings with human and animal figures and filled the panels with inscriptions of Quranic verses, floral or geometric pattern. Needless to say that Taj Mahal is considered to be one of the finest specimens of Indo-Islamic architecture in India. Now, since there are many in Agra, in Fatehpur Sikri, in Delhi, in Old Delhi, even in eastern part of India, you go to Gulbarga in south, in Karnataka, there are plenty of such beautiful Indo-Islamic architectures, and they have become like permanent features of Indian culture. Now, this needs to be understood. Though Indo-Islamic architecture began to emerge on the landscape of Indian culture due to the arrival of the Muslim leaders from roughly 12th century AD onwards, and that is why we have the Sultanate dynasty, and that is why we have the famous mighty Mughal Empire. But when you look at these architectures very carefully, when you study these architectures very carefully, you can gradually find out that these architectures are not foreign architectures on a foreign land, and it has to be so. Why? First of all, just think about this fact that though these architectures in terms of its design and concept are absolutely new, Indians have not seen something like this before. This is true, but who were the masons? Who were the craftsmen? Who were the people who were actually building this up? Not architects and craftsmen imported all the way from Persia. All these people were local craftsmen, local artisans, they were local masons, local architects. So, it is quite natural that within the fold of Islamic architecture, a lot of pre-Islamic Indian elements would also get a chance to infiltrate and merge into the entire conception. And that is why we consider this entire tradition not as Islamic architecture or Muslim architecture. We categorically use the term Indo-Islamic architecture. It is Indo-Islamic. Truly it is a combination of two kinds of cultural elements within one fold. But at the same time it is Islamic also because these architectures, as I just mentioned, came up to meet the new set of requirements from a new kind of society. Previously you did have stupa, but after all stupa was not a mausoleum. I mean, it was not a tomb, though it is believed that in some of the stupas relics of Buddha were kept, relics, not the entire body of Buddha. So, if you have a Sultanate emperor, a Sultanate king or a Mughal emperor, after death if you want, or if his son wants to build a huge mausoleum, a huge tomb in respect to pay a homage to the great man, the deceased man. So, you have mausoleum, you have tombs, you have most wonderful beautiful mosques built by the patrons from Sultanate and Mughal period. You also have palaces, you also have gateways. So, different kind of architectural concepts now came into being as a part of this Indo-Islamic culture. And they all became part of the Indian cultural landscape. So, it is now today impossible to imagine, to even imagine old Delhi without Jama Masjid. So, look at this Jama Masjid, how it has become one of the most popular and well known symbols of Delhi. So, like Taj Mahal, like Fatehpur Sikri, like Agra Fort, these are not foreign architectures on a foreign land. Now, we were talking about domes and arches as far as the Jama Masjid and Taj Mahal and many other Indo-Islamic architecture are concerned. But at the same time there are examples like this one from Fatehpur Sikri, where it is not arch or dome, but rectangular spaces and pillars which are direct influences of the pre-Islamic, Hindu or Buddhist architecture or indigenous Indian traditional architectural elements. And in other words, most of these Indo-Islamic architectures, particularly if you are looking at the Mughal architecture, you will find that the Mughal architects never ever felt hesitant to borrow from the Indian indigenous tradition to assimilate Indian indigenous elements within or as a part of their architectural concept. And that is why the term Indo-Islamic architecture is absolutely fitting. So, apart from mausoleums, mosques, tombs, Mughal palaces, we also have another very interesting kind of architecture which was perhaps not there before the advent of the Muslims in India, that is fort. So, we have Agra Fort, we have Delhi Fort, we have Daulatabad Fort, and then of course, we have Maratha forts in the Vidarbha region, but these are all extensions of that traditions. Prior to these forts, did Indians have any concept of fort? Please find out yourself. I am not giving any answer to this question. Let us find out whether the very concept of fort existed in India. I mean, visible, physical evidence. We need physical evidence to prove that yes, there was fort. before the Indo-Islamic architecture. So, if we find one, then it would be very interesting to compare those forts with the Indo-Islamic forts like this one, Agra fort, or go to any other forts in Delhi and Old Delhi or Maharashtra Daulatabad and find out yourself. So, Indo-Islamic architecture began flourishing with all its splendor and technical innovations mainly from the 13th century. As the Muslim rulers had to depend on indigenous craftsmen and masons, something that I mentioned just now, Hindu motifs like, you won't believe, something like a swastika, something like lotus made their way into many of these Indo-Islamic architectures as decorative devices. The most important example of the early Sultanate architecture was the Qutub Minar, built during the 13th century. So far we have been talking about the overall structural appearance or look of this Indo-Islamic architecture. Now, since we have just mentioned Qutub Minar, let us look at the details, at least of Qutub Minar. For example, the surface details, the decorative details, the ornamental details and their varieties in Indo-Islamic architecture are as important as the structural shape and the overall concept of the architecture. Unless you go very close and look at the details carefully, from distance it is difficult to believe that the entire Qutub Minar has very, very intricate carvings, that the entire Qutub Minar has detailed ornamental decorations with variations all over its surface. So, on the one hand, it is the large massive appearance of Indo-Islamic architecture. On the other hand, it is also about the details, the motifs, the decorations, the inlaid stones, the use of very colorful stones on many such Indo-Islamic buildings. So, it is a combination of the powerful appearance of the architecture and very delicate designs on the surface. This combination is what Indo-Islamic architecture is all about to some extent. Then of course, we should also be experiencing the space inside such architecture. It is very difficult to articulate in words the kind of experience you have when you enter, let us say for example, Humayun's tomb, when you enter Jama Masjid, when you enter Agra Fort, when you enter Fatehpur Sikri. Please find that out yourself. When you visit any such place next time, what kind of physical experience exactly you are having once you are inside such building. From outside, we can talk about the architectural qualities, the characteristic features, the surface details, that is fine. But what about the interior? What is the experience of being inside such a huge architectural piece or a building? This needs a different study altogether. For the time being, let us remind ourselves of the fact that Islamic architecture had grown under completely different civilization as far as the Persian, Turkish architectural traditions are concerned. And it was alien architecture for India to begin with, having principles and a sense of beauty totally different from Indian traditional architecture, needless to say. Now, sultans and his ministers were well grounded in their own architecture and they wanted to build mosques and palaces same as in their home countries. But gradually, or I would say not so gradually, quite quickly they realized that they need to transform. They need to kind of evolve. It would be completely a mistake to stick to what they used to do back home. To make the architecture suitable to the Indian soil, they need to go for some changeover, and that they did. And who did? Not the main architects or the sultans, but the craftsmen, the local craftsmen. Once again, we should we paying our great respect and homage to these anonymous, unknown, hundreds of local craftsmen, without whom these wonderful architectures would not have happened at all. So, that is how this assimilation we were talking about took place. So, since craftsmen who constructed these buildings actually were often Indians, so a strong assimilations began to appear between the pre-Islamic Indian and the new Islamic elements. Then this is also a vexed question, that what was the difference between Indian traditional architecture and the new Islamic architecture that is coming from outside? We need to compare and see. We do not really need to go into the technical details right now. We need to look at the appearance, we need to look at the proportion, we need to look at the requirements, the kind of demands these new Indo-Islamic architectures were able to satisfy, and how these demands were different from the demands the pre-Islamic Indian architectures were able to satisfy. Because after all, architecture is not a piece of sculpture only to be aesthetically enjoyed and understood. Architecture is something that is very functional, something that serves the society, serves people. It is something very pragmatic, very practical. So, we need to approach Indo-Islamic architecture from this perspective as well. How these architectures are able to satisfy the new demands of a new society and what those demands were. Now, another interesting element introduced in Indo-Islamic architecture was this idea of gardening. It was not there initially, but as they found out that they were having, let us say, a tomb or a mausoleum within a compound which is very huge, why do not we develop that space as a garden? And what kind of garden? Not a British or a French garden. It is a very Indo-Islamic garden, and we should be giving credit particularly to the Mughals, because these Mughals, they paid lot of attention to this idea of garden. Go to Kashmir, go to Srinagar, go to Agra, you will, all these places where, go to Lahore, all these places where Mughals lived, they built beautiful gardens with the pretext of having a maybe a small little tomb or a mausoleum. It often appears that the tomb is not so important. More than the tomb, it is a garden, the sprawling garden around the tomb that becomes visually, aesthetically, and also environmentally very charming. And they started experimenting with the gardening, the layout of the garden, what kind of trees they would be. So, and gardening becomes an essential part of Indo-Islamic architecture. So, next time whenever you visit such a place, do not ignore the garden through which you walk and reach the mausoleum, because the garden surrounding the building is an essential part, and it did become an essential part of the building itself. So, there are plenty of such like Sikandar Lodi tomb, then the Gol Gumbaj in Golconda, then the Fatehpur Sikri, and everywhere you go you see gardens. Apart from that, like this one, the Buland Darwaza in Fatehpur Sikri is neither a mausoleum nor a tomb, it is not a mosque, it is not a palace. So, what is this? A darwaza, a gateway. Even a gateway, a simple gateway can assume the scale of a huge architecture, and it is considered to be the largest gate in Asia or maybe in the world, I do not know. I mean, it is huge, it is massive. So, the whole idea, I mean, we do have, say for example, if you go to South India and study the South Indian Dravida type of temple architecture, you do have Gopuram. Gopurams are a kind of entrance to the main temple. Like in, you go to Kanchipuram, you go to Brihadashara, you go to Hampi and look at the Virupaksha temple, everywhere you find huge Gopuram, but these are all later temple architectures. But as early as like in Fatehpur Sikri during Akbar's time, he got this huge gateway built. There were purposes, I am not discussing that right now, but I am talking about the impression that you have when you stand not in front of the gateway, but down, you are looking up, the flight of the staircase leading to the gateway, which is a huge gateway known as Buland Darwaza. So, these are the new, absolutely stunning new novel contributions of Indo-Islamic architecture to Indian tradition. And there are many portions within Fatehpur Sikri, for example, which resemble somewhat like a temple. So, these architects of Indo-Islamic architecture, they really felt free to accommodate elements which originally did not belong to their faith. As a result, many of these Indo-Islamic architectures are not only eclectic in nature, but they assumed a kind of vibrancy, a kind of liveliness because of this plurality of elements, because of this multiculturalism that is not to be found in the Islamic architectures outside India, generally speaking. Then within Agra forts there are details, there are portions, there are certain corners where you find, as I was telling you in the context of the Qutub Minar, surface design or surface decoration. So, in order to appreciate Indo-Islamic architecture, you need to look at the scale, the overall impression, for example, like Buland Darwaza or Qutub Minar or Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal obviously looks brilliant from distance, but it also looks marvelous from proximity, because there are beautiful details which need to be noticed and appreciated. This is from Bijapur, from South India. It is called Ibrahim Roja. Ibrahim Roja is another example like Humayun's tomb and Lodhi's tomb, where they tried to create a beautiful garden around the main structure. Garden therefore becomes essential within the context of Indo-Islamic architecture. So, it is true that different religious beliefs are also reflected in the mode of construction and architectural styles. The Islamic style also incorporated many elements from the traditional Indian style, and a compound of style emanated. it is a combination of various styles. The introduction of decorative brackets, balconies, then pendentive decorations, etc. There are a lot of interesting elements in the architecture which the moment you look at, you feel you must have seen them elsewhere before the beginning of Indo-Islamic architecture. It is true. Many of these elements were borrowed and used very intelligently, very aesthetically within the fold of Indo-Islamic architecture. The other distinguishing features of Indo-Islamic architecture are the utilization of kiosks, something like a dome like a parasol, then of course tall towers which are known as minars. Kiosks are locally known as chhatris, and half domed double portals. As human worship and its representation are not allowed in Islam, you do not depict any deity, no iconographic representation is allowed. Hence, these buildings and other edifices are generally decorated richly with very innovative and elaborate geometrical and arabesque designs. So, when I was talking about the surface design, I am basically trying to draw your attention to the decorative, geometrical and arabesque designs. They are not very simple designs, mind you. When you start looking at them, when you begin to study these designs, you will find they are very complex and complicated designs. So, there were designers who were constantly researching on the possibilities of geometrical and arabesque designs to be used on the surface of Indo-Islamic architecture. So, these designs were carved on stone in low relief, they were cut on plaster, they were painted, and very frequently they were inlaid. So, you get to see a lot of inlay works in the Islamic architectures. The use of lime as mortar was also a major element distinct from the traditional building style. Hence, for example, if you go and look at Akbar's tomb, which is known as Sikandar near Agra. Well, it is very impressive building. It is impressive not just because of its scale and its design, it is very impressive also because of its surface design. So, next time you are in Agra, do not forget to visit Akbar's tomb, which is in Sikandar. So, this is the main gateway to enter to the Akbar's tomb complex, and like other tombs and other architectural complexes, this also has a beautiful garden inside. The tomb architecture hence is a very important feature of the Islamic architecture, as the practice of the burial of the dead is adopted, and the general pattern of the tomb architecture is consisted of a domed chamber, which is known as hujra, a cenotaph in its center with a mihrab on the western wall, and the real grave in the underground chamber. To this general tomb architecture, the Mughals added a new dimension by introducing gardens all around. So, the Mughals added gardens all around the tomb. They added gardens around their palace. Garden thus became a very important element as a part of the architectural concept. Look at some of these gardens now. This is the Humayun tomb. The garden is properly laid out and it integrates very well with the architectural design. It is the same Humayun tomb, a photograph that is taken from top, which allows us to see the layout of the garden. So, the garden is not just naturally, it is not something that is allowed to grow naturally. It has been properly laid out, and this laying out of the garden was determined by the architectural design of the main edifice. So, this is how the garden or the landscaping of the complex and the main building get integrated with each other. We began with the photograph of Taj Mahal. Now, once again we end up also with the photograph of Taj Mahal. Of course, this is one of the best specimens, no doubt, but Taj Mahal is not the only marvelous architecture belonging to the Indo-Islamic architectural tradition. In fact, Taj Mahal gives an idea, because it is considered to be a classical example, but we also need to look at the entire range of Islamic architecture in order to see that how Taj Mahal looks like a culmination of Indo-Islamic architecture, and how there are also other kinds of architectures which are as beautiful as and as marvelous as Taj Mahal, but they need to be more studied, more talked about and more appreciated. So, we wind up today's lecture by making us aware of this fact that Indo-Islamic architecture has a very strong and a beautiful presence in the cultural history of India. We need to look at them, we need to study them, we need to at least appreciate them, keeping this in our mind that it is a combination of delicacy and strength. Thank you.